Okay. If you have not already done so, there's a half sheet of paper back. There's two half sheets. One with the information about the two opportunities that are coming. And the other one is a feedback form that I'd like you to have as we start, along with a pen. So if you haven't grabbed one, if you could do that, I'll wait a moment till everybody has one. Maybe we can hand those out, make sure everybody's got one. Okay. Yep. For those of you who I can't imagine don't know me, I'm Bob Giroux. I'm a retired educator, and I'm a member of the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry, who's the last three programs, the last two plus this one, are part of the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry. So, welcome to the third installment of our presentation. We're going to be exploring the idea that for many Christians, culture and politics drive their thinking and faith is subordinate to that. And in hopes that that will help us have an understanding of some of the events that have been happening with the Ottawa Impact folks and locally. Okay? So, before we begin, you might have noticed that I've not been in attendance for the past two presentations. You might not. But if you did, I have a question for you. Let's see if I can get it to work. What have you learned from the previous two sessions? And I've supplied you with a half sheet of paper, and I'm going to give you a moment here to do some writing. I want you to think about that. What would you tell someone like me who's not been in attendance what it's been like these last 2 weeks? What have you grabbed? What's important to you? What do you think I need to know before I get started? I'm going to ask you to take a moment and write something, and then I'm going to ask for a couple of volunteers to share. And at the end of the program, as a favor to the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry, if you'd leave those half sheets on the table back there, then we have a little bit of feedback about how people felt about the first two. So I'll give you a moment here. A reminder, the first week was what I call data, data, data. You probably were all staring into space by the time he was done with all the data. And then the second one was the church history of racism and patriarchy. So take a moment and think about those. Okay, if you finish up your thought. Do I have a volunteer or two who would like to share just an observation about your thoughts about what's happened in the last couple of weeks? Anyone? Anyone? Yep, David.
We are recorded.
David Alexander, one of the most hit me in the side of the head things that's come up in the last 2 weeks is our use of the adjective white when we talk about Christian nationalism, because I had used to think of it just as its own cross wrapped in a flag thing. But putting that white on there really whopped me on the side of the head. Thank you.
Anyone else? We good? Okay. All right, so before we get started, let's start today by refocusing on our purpose for these presentations. We have some very concrete things we'd like you to get out of these presentations. All right, we seek an understanding, okay, that helps us to build a beloved community. We ask ourselves, how might we undertake a conversation with people in our community, both within this church and within the larger community, who have those views? How can we cross that bridge? And we want to think about what it might look like to build a strategy of reconciliation for Hope Church. So those are really concrete things. It's easy to get lost in the history and everything else, but we're trying to build towards these three things. Okay? All right. So now I'm going to, notice how I dropped this heavy topic onto you. Civic engagement versus partisanship in Hope Church. I got the wonderful task of trying to parse this out for everyone. And so I want to start by talking about what civic engagement looks like. Civic engagement in Hope Church is a group of members led by Lois Mawson and Cindy Turlow, working under the banner of Unifying Hope, who are actively trying to apply the principles laid out in the Ottawa Coalition of Unifying Christians statement of principles for civic engagement. In the preamble to their statement, the coalition states that they believe God calls us to take a public stand on issues that impact the common good of all residents in this county. Our churches do not endorse or reject individual candidates for public office, but do strive to support policies and programs which benefit all of our neighbors and speak out against those which do not. Okay? So here at Hope Church, the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry has been discerning and crafting our own set of principles. Indeed, much of the past 2 weeks' adult ed presentation and today's presentation have been making an argument for the need for Hope Church to make a statement declaring ourselves an anti-racist church. The plan is to provide our congregation, all of us, an opportunity to read and make an advisory vote to the consistory on that statement in our annual January Great Congregation meeting. So that's where we're headed. Okay? However, before we get to Peter, let me move to the next page carefully. All right. So that said, I want to acknowledge, I hadn't thought of it, I just thought of it. I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And that is that we're going to be talking to some degree just about one particular political party in particular. As our first presenter is going to point out, white evangelical Christians form the core faction of the current version of the Republican Party. As such, evangelical Christians call the shots within that party, and they amplifying their political power well beyond their total numbers relative to the total population of the United States and to the total population of the Republican Party. So we're going to talk about them and what's going on there. But in doing so, the challenge of today is to engage in conversation that is not partisan, nor gives off the appearance of partisanship, but strives to describe what is real as a means to understand it with a goal of creating an effective response where it is called for. Okay? So our first presenter, our first video, is Peter Weiner. He's a senior fellow at Trinity Forum, and he's going to use a term, catechesis. So who can tell me? Anyone? Anyone? There are several people in this audience who know a whole lot more about this than I do, so I'm not going to presume. Okay, I'll throw this definition up there. All right. He's using the term to talk about the changing sources of catechesis in our culture, which he describes as a source of a failure of catechesis in our time. And so that's an important concept he's going to use in this presentation. Okay? So with that, we're going to turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, EJ. Ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Jamar, for those powerful and I think true comments. A couple of points. I'll turn it over to Kristen, and then we'll have a conversation. Maybe the first one to begin with, I'm going to speak as a person of the Christian faith, because I am a person of the Christian faith. It's core to who I am. And I just want to say what I think is a cognitive dissonance, which is I think it'd be hard to find a figure in human history less likely to be a Christian nationalist than Jesus. I just think the cognitive dissonance of that is tremendously powerful. This is a person who was trying to break down the dividing walls and didn't see in nationalist terms, and yet to see him invoked, or his movement invoked, or those who claim to follow his name to use Christian nationalism the way they do, is puzzling and in many ways horrifying, and saying that as a person of the Christian faith. Second thing that I want to do is, when I go over the data that Robbie amassed, which is very, very helpful, I think it does need to be disaggregated, and he touched on this in his remarks. One is just the general public, how much affinity is there, varying degrees of affinity for Christian nationalism in the country as a whole, and it's certainly not a majority. But then how much of a hold does that movement have on the Republican Party? And that's a very different question. 2/3 of white evangelicals have some degree of affinity with how white nationalism, white Christian nationalism is defined. The white evangelicals are the core, the most important constituency in the Republican Party. And so they basically carry the tune, and the party itself follows it. So there's a disproportionate influence on one of the two most important political parties in the world. And I think that means that this, what I perceive to be a threat, is larger than just the aggregate numbers would say. I'd also make the point that that there are views that one has, and then there's the question of what flows from the views, right? So you can check a box and say I agree or I disagree with X. That's very different from thinking that what I believe is going to drive me to act. And I do think a couple of the numbers that stood out to me that are in the poll and data was 17% of white Christian nationalists are willing to fight to keep the country that way, and the other is the resort to violence, 40%. What I think that means is it's not, again, just how you check your box on a view. Life and politics is about disposition, temperament, and sensibilities. And I think that this white Christian nationalism view is shaping sensibilities in a very strong way. EJ has covered politics for a long time too, but I can't remember the sort of energy that's behind this movement in politics in general. In my lifetime in politics. Politics is by its nature a passionate endeavor, and it should be, because it involves a lot of stuff. But I think the aggression and the cultural aggression that we're seeing now is different and worrisome. Third thing I want to talk about is catechesis. It's a fancy word, but if you talk to a lot of people within the Christian community, theologians, pastors, it's the shaping of those sensibilities. And in a lot of conversations that I've had with pastors and theologians, they talk about this failure of catechesis. And we saw that, Robbie, in the sources of information that people watch. This is what they imbibe. Russell Moore is a good friend of mine, has a term. He talks about Jesus as a hood ornament. And I think what's happened, and this is unwitting, I think, for a lot of people of Christian faith, they would say that that Christianity, following Jesus, is the most important thing in their life. I think in practice it's not. And I think that a lot of people are blind to it. And I'm going to confess, I'm sure I've struggled with this too. It's easier to see it in other people, blind spots, than it is obviously in your own. But I think what's happening is that culture, sociology, politics, partisanship is the thing that's driving a lot of people's views. And faith is subordinate to that. And then people proof text the Bible to affirm what they already believe. So I think this catechesis point is a very important one, and just one figure that I'll mention in that context is Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is the most important figure on the American right media. He's the most important figure at Fox News. And you can see the direction that he's going in, over time. And it's a bad direction, and it's an ugly direction, and it's a dangerous direction. But that's the kind of fuel that's driving this. Last thing, and this is echoing what Jamar, a lot of what I said, I guess, is echoing what he said. But that we're talking here about the threat to American democracy, which is really important, and we should care about that. But I do want to end by emphasizing the threat to American Christianity. This is acid. This is acid. And a lot of people who are not a people of faith are watching this unfold, and they're looking at it, and they're saying, this is a freak show. You want me to join this thing? And this is antithetical, as Mike wrote, to the Beatitudes and to much else. And I do think that if this issue is going to be solved, at least mitigated, an awful lot of work has to come from the church itself. And that is a task that a lot of people that I know, pastors and theologians, again, are really concerned about, but they're searching around because they haven't traditionally wanted to involve themselves in politics. But they're going to have to do it because that's the landscape. And if that's happening, if this is unfolding among your own adherents, it seems to me you have some moral obligation to be able to take responsibility for that. There's a great line in Wordsworth in the poem, The Prelude, that we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. And I do think that people who are authentic followers of Jesus have to love that, and they have to teach other people within their community how to love that as well. Thanks, EJ.
There we go. Okay. We have this really strong cultural ethic rising from the creation of our Constitution and as a nation of separation of church and state. And it really grates against us as a Christian community, and especially our leaders, our pastors, speaking out on issues of politics. There's a fine line there. And it seems to me he's calling us to think about that line, and Hope Church to think about how do we do that, how best to do that. So I'm going to open it up to you. I want to see what you're thinking about what you just heard, what you think was salient. Anyone? Good.
I think it's, wait for the mic, Try to express what all is in my mind at one time. This is very difficult. That statement, Jesus as a hood ornament, when he mentioned about people having their own political agenda, those cultural aspects, and then tying that into what they believe is Christian-like. I've witnessed that. Yeah, I guess I'm just putting that out there right now. Maybe some can build off of that. I have no idea.
I was just thinking about how hard it is to work through what is appropriate. Because I was thinking about the questionnaire that we filled out the first day, and there was the question about your Christian values and their place in the public square. And I really struggled with what to put, where to find that on that continuum that we had. Because it seems to me there's a fine line between what it means to live out Christian principles, caring for others and the world, versus co-opting religion for them. So anyway, that's kind of where my point of struggle is.
I'm sure you're not alone in that.
You want to go? You'll be after Jane.
Hi, Jane Dickey. I'm reminded of the fact that the times require us to be a different church than we were. I remember back in the 70s, maybe, late 70s, when Marlon was preaching. I loved Marlon, and I loved his preaching. And he stood at the pulpit and he said, I don't want to be, I can't be political, but I want you to think carefully about this school millage that's coming up. And that's all he would say. And those times, during those times, that was a statement, that was a bold political kind of semi-endorsement of please pass this millage. And I'm just thinking about how far we've come to need bolder statements about the political realities around us as Christians to speak up about those.
David Alexander again. I think the quote up there, Jesus as a hood ornament, Russell Moore, is made even more strong by the fact that Russell Moore was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, was he not? I got nods here, yeah. And then slipping something political as a clergy member, I was in Taiwan when the Taiwan Presbyterian Church made a statement to the nation. It included the words new and independent nation, which got some people thrown in jail. And then 18 years later, I was a pastor of a Taiwanese church, and I would, from time to time in preaching, slip in something about when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt to form a new and independent nation. And finally my wife said, can it, man, just can it. But I managed to get that phrase, new and independent nation, which was a dog whistle to my people, into sermons from time to time. Thank you.
I think we've got 5 minutes, maybe one more, and then
One
we'll
more.
get back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Jim Marshall. I have to confess, I didn't expect to say anything because we're so new here, but this is precisely why we came here. So if the separation of church and state, which is so constitutionally imploring, would restrict our pastors, then it places the responsibility, as it should, on the body of Christ to speak up. And I think the more passionate we are, the more dangerous it becomes, because we can violate the same code of love in the way we communicate about these conflicts with our brothers and sisters who are not in agreement with us. So it's a huge responsibility for us to prepare for.
Yeah, thank you for that.
We need to go back to you now.
Yep. And I'm gonna ask David Meyer to reflect on one piece from that, my little piece, and that is he talked about how he can't remember how much energy there's been in politics in his time of life as there is now, and the possible source of that being in the fractured news media that we listen to each telling a story about what's important in our lives.
So I would just first of all say that there's abundant evidence. I wasn't here the first week, and maybe that's what was presented, that we're more polarized than in any of our memories. That is, the percentage of people who are Democrats who hate Republicans and the percentage of Republicans who hate Democrats has gone like from 20% to 50%. I mean, would you want your child to marry one? It's that level of animosity. So it is a very powerful contemporary phenomenon. And as I've been sitting here, I mean, what I've been reflecting on is just a kind of a conceptual question. What's the appropriate stance for a place like Hope Church and a community of Hope Church people to take? On the one hand, we're a tax-exempt organization. We have diversity among our midst. We have Republicans and Democrats, and we want to be respectful of that diversity. We're not an arm of the Democratic Party, and so all that we need to remember. But as Jane was pointing out, if we say nothing, we're not speaking to our own culture at our own time. So I'm not giving an answer to the question. I'm just saying it's the question that's been in my mind during our conversation this morning. How is it that we can articulate the ethics of Jesus for our time? How is it that we can apply the Beatitude principles and remind ourselves of those without being explicitly partisan or disrespectful of our own diversity?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so our next segment we're going to watch is Robert Jones. He's the guy who did the survey and parses it on history and whiteness in the church.
I think it's I'm so glad to have historians in the room, by the way. Thank you for that. You know, Jamar, to your points, you know, the one thing I was interested in is seeing the way, what difference white identity made, right? So even in people who share the set of commitments to kind of Christian supremacy, really, in the country, and like that, you know, the one that, the U.S. law should be based on Christian values. I mean, pretty straightforward. These are, by the way, just like if you go back and look at all 5 of those questions, they are all anti-democratic sentiments, right? And when I make that point to sure, they are Christian dominionist sentiments. They're fundamentally incompatible with a pluralistic democracy. So I want to get that out there too. But even inside there, what you see is that the way they correlate, there's some complexity as I showed, but the way they correlate with concepts of anti-blackness, concepts of anti-immigrant attitudes, and anti-Muslim attitudes in particular, is where whiteness really rears its head, even inside of the group that shares those sentiments. And I think, and it's stronger, right, among those who go to church. Right, so like that's the thing we got to like remember here, and so that takes me to Pete. And Pete, like, so I grew up, you know, in the South as an evangelical Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, and it is heartbreaking to see this data. Right, those are my people, right? And you see that data, but the journey that I've been on is I realize, you know, and what Krista said, this is not new. And how do we get here, right? That we've lost all purchase on the difference between the Jesus of the Bible and, you know, the stuff. And I think the way we got here is, you know, the Southern Baptist Convention, which became and still is the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country, was founded to justify slavery. That's how we got here, right? And so every time we took the path of accepting white supremacy as part and parcel of Christianity, which we did over and over and over through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, right? Every time we did that, we strengthened its hand, right? And so now we wonder about it, the impotence of our churches to kind of wrestle control back, right? But it's because for hundreds of years we've accepted, right, these things as being compatible. So I think that's the real challenge. And on the not new part, I think that's really important. This is a new label for a very old problem. And the one thing I wanted to point to that hasn't really come up, but this idea of America as a promised land for European Christians, right, is so deep and so strong, right, within us. And this idea that the words you will hear this prefix re over and over and over, reclaim, revive, restore, right, and make America great again, right? All these backward-looking, reclaiming kind of things, I think, are about how old this idea really is and the power that it has with us today. So I'll stop there. I think it's a...
Let's go back. All right. Your thoughts? What do you care to share as you listen to? How always rises, how bad is this? I mean, how bad is it? And so for a context, a historical context, in the 1880s, for the entire decade, in the United States of America, a black human being was lynched every day of every year. Now, we're not there, but where are we?
I've had the opportunity to talk with many people out by their houses and door knocking, and it's been quite an experience and a lot of positive interactions. And one of the things, though, when I read this statement is equality feels like oppression. And sometimes in my discussions, we talk about the DEI, and it's not equality, but it's equity. And that's a trigger to some people that all of a sudden they shut down. And to me, that feels like there is that feeling of being oppressed, because I'm talking about, having it so people can kind of enjoy the same things. There's that equity process, even though it's not equality. They're okay with equality because they see everyone being equal. But the bigger term was equity is more of that threat, in my opinion, from the people that I've talked with.
Good morning, Ron Mulder. I think one thing that all Americans and all Christians can believe is in our society we have to have legitimacy, and in the electoral process, legitimacy usually means whoever gets the majority of votes serves. There's no guarantee in the United States or in the Constitution, in spite of the 15th Amendment, of the right to vote. There's no national guarantee. And I think that's a process that may take an amendment that everybody could get behind. And then remember, we talked in the first session about where sovereignty really rests. Is it local, is it state, is it national? And that friction brings out a lot of creativity, but it also brings out a lot of confusion. And so you have different voting procedures all over the country. There ought to be some kind of consensus and legal remedy for what are uniform voting practices. Mm-hmm. And then you think about the Reconstruction period, and you even think about with the resignation of Richard Nixon. It always surprised me that with those two presidents in particular and their successors, and I'm no way equating Gerald Ford with Andrew Johnson, but they served, Johnson was about 3.5 years as vice president who was not officially elected. If somebody is going to, in my opinion, if somebody's going to serve less than 2 years, fine, that's just progress or procedure. But someone who's going to serve more than 2 years, there ought to be another presidential election. And I really applaud Gerald Ford, not only because he's from Western Michigan and he was a Wolverine. By the way, it's great to be a Wolverine today.
Please.
I'm sorry about that plug. But I'm really not. But you got to have an electoral process that legitimatizes the majority. And we don't have that now. You can go over American history, and there are many presidents, including many recent presidencies, that did not achieve a majority vote. So the campaigning is done toward more the battleground states where the electoral votes really count in electing the president. And we also ought to do away with the Electoral College, in my opinion.
Is that 5, Judy? Yeah, okay. Okay, so a couple of thoughts before we move on. One, I'm going to lose my thought now. One is, as we think about this, he's talking history here, history of church. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm ignorant of the history of Hope Church, even though Judy wrote a great book. I need to go back and read that book now. So when we think about, well, what is our, I don't know, what do I want to say? I don't want to say guilt. What is our part in that racial divide within the Christian church? What is Hope Church part? As a basis for what we do going forward, I think we have to have a conversation about that at some point in time, perhaps. Okay? And the other piece that I want to point, because I want to go locally here, is what's the first thing that Ottawa Impact did? Their very first meeting. I was at that very first meeting. What is the first thing that was number one on their agenda? They got rid of DEI. They described it as divisive, and if you
Describe it, don't just give the initials.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they got rid of the county, what do you call that? Slogan. Yeah. We all belong. Apparently we don't all belong. So just as a thought to connect that with what he's talking about. Okay. So our next segment, we're going to hear Kristen Demez, who you're going to get a chance to hear if you take advantage of that opportunity that's coming, on the role of Christian education, and Peter Wiener on not cartooning white Christian nationalists. So let's do that.
Thank you very much. Economic power up until the 60s pretty much rested with white people. It didn't matter if you were in control of the Ford GM management structure or...
So I should have introduced this by saying they're going to respond to a series of questions from the audience, just so you have the context.
Thank you very much. Economic power up until the 60s pretty much rested with white people. It didn't matter if you were in control of the Ford GM management structure or you had the day versus the night shift in the factory floor. So isn't it true for white people that they have less economic power and feel that way than they did in 1955 when they didn't have to compete with blacks, they didn't have to compete with women? I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying the average 75-year-old remembers when they ruled, rich or poor.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Rachel Lazar, right over here. Catalina, I'm just going to do this corner here, and then we'll do it geographically. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been incredible. Thanks for the amazing research once again, Robbie. So church-state separation feels like the obvious solution and antidote, right? Because for a group that is trying to cement their power and privilege and codify it in our law, if we say you have to separate church and state, you fight back effectively. What is the most important strategy in your minds for nationally recommitting to church-state separation, and especially since we're such a predominantly still religious nation because of church-state separation.
Would you remind people of your job
Yes.
in light of that question?
I am the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State.
Bless you. Thank you. Sir, yeah, we'll do all four of you then. Yeah, go ahead. If you real.
Sure. Todd Stiefel, head of Stiefel Free Thought Foundation. I'm curious, at least in my mind, it feels like the kind of war on education that's going on in Florida and elsewhere is much rooted in a attempt to kind of whitewash the history of Christian nationalism in this country. And I'm curious if you folks agree with that and what we can do about it.
And then lastly, for this round, thank you.
Hi, I'm Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and lead organizer of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So I have two questions that really stood out for me from the excellent presentation, Robbie. One was the slide on the relationship between Christian nationalism adherents and anti-Black racism. And I thought it really complicated the question of the relationship of white supremacy and Christian nationalism. How much is this white supremacy that is using, in Jamar's words, the permission structure of Christian nationalism, and how much of this can be really attributed to Christian nationalism as an ideology itself? And the second slide that caught my attention was about the fact that if you go to church more, you're more likely to be a Christian nationalist. I think that begs the question about what's going on in our churches and how much of it is Christianity, how much of it is Christian nationalism. That's an active conversation going on in a lot of quarters, and I would just love your understanding of how we understand Christianity as opposed to Christian nationalism.
And could I add an extra point to that question, which is how much of it is a detachment of liberal Christians from Christianity? Because the fact that their church going is connected to that suggests it's a two-way street going on there. And I'd be very curious, anyone else before Robbie throws data at us with a great curve and fastball? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to this too in terms of what we saw in the media, kind of quote unquote secular media, right? Fox News and so on, very important. I don't want to diminish their role. What's not in this survey is Christian media. And explicitly Christian media, because I don't know that we can call Fox secular purely. And so what we're looking at, this deep story has been, use the term catechesis. We could use the term indoctrination, grooming, if you will, or discipleship, right? What are we talking about here? But what we see is for generations now, Christian publishers, Christian radio, Christian homeschool curriculum, Christian school textbooks have told this story, the story about America, the story about Christianity, right? It runs deep. And so this is not ultimately a story of politics hijacking religion, right? Christianity, whether we can make claims about you got Christianity wrong, but people who think they are Christians, who claim the Christian faith, are from the grassroots up, inculcating this, articulating this, and reinforcing it. So I think that's a very important point.
And also the possibility that the mainstream media may give disproportionate attention. I suppose we are guilty of that today, but that the mainstream media give disproportionate attention to this brand. I'd be curious, Pete, if you've thought about that.
I'd say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that white evangelical Christianity involves millions and millions of people, and really good and decent people. I know of stories. I was out at Calvin University a couple of weeks ago, and Nick Walderstorff was talking about the church that he had started and to house Syrian refugees. And you see this all over the country, these acts of tremendous charity and self-giving. The church that I'm a part of, McLean Prez, is taking in Afghan refugees. Those stories often don't get told. They ought to be told. On the other hand, this is real. Something has changed, and there's a real threat. We saw it most vividly in January 6th, and you see it rising. this is below the radar, but I think it's important that this tour that Michael Flynn, former National Security Advisor, is doing, which is the imprimatur of Charisma News, is, I mean, that's really grassroots, and a lot of people aren't following it. They should. I just want to make one quick point, EJ. It touches on one of the questions you got, which is how do you start conversations with people who hold views different. And here I'm talking to you, but I'm also talking to myself. And that is, I have to be careful not to dehumanize the people who I disagree with. It's really easy to do, and it's easy for me to put people in create cartoon images and boxes in the same way that I feel like others do. In my experience, and this I've changed in the last 15 years, I would say 10, 15 years, I have much less faith in the capacity to overwhelm people by arguments, by data, certainly by condescension. Ultimately, I don't know how you do this writ large. I do know how you do it writ small, which is you have to enter into people's lives. And what I've tried to do when I've done it best, and I haven't always done it best, is to try and listen to the people. Tell me about your experience. Why do you believe what you believe? Because Kristen said something very important. There are issues, and then these issues are often proxy for core identity, right? You're having a discussion with someone, you're thinking, why is there so much energy around this issue? And the reason is it's not the issue. It's what that issue represents. And when any of us feel our core identity is under attack, if we feel like we're losing power, if we think that the country is on the edge, if we think our kids are under attack, that's going to stir up a lot of strong feelings. So I just think it's really important to try and enter into the world without necessarily, I obviously have my strong views on this, without acceding to them. So I just wanted to.
Okay. Some thoughts on that. That was light entertainment.
So I have a brother who lives in Hudsonville, and I had him and his wife and actually a couple of other people over for dinner the other night, and I don't know why he makes these comments when he's with me, but I think, you know, I've got books around that clearly are about things like racism, and the art on my walls probably speak the wrong things to him, and he makes blatant racist comments. He didn't do it right with me, did it with my husband the other day, but before he has. And I needed Peter's comment the other night. I needed to be able to say to him, tell me where that comes from. What experience have you had that leads you to that conclusion? And I know enough to do that, but in the moment, I freeze up. And I don't know if anyone else does, but I just fail miserably at that. And I wanted to make that confession, but also hear what other ideas people have about what to do when that happens in your presence.
Well, Ruth, in part, my response to you is, it's an understandable freeze because you're potentially pivoting to a very dangerous conversation in your relationship. So you're talking about fundamental values. And you got a brother. I have a brother in a similar situation, actually, more his younger son, and it's just how much of the family fabric do I want to rend in order to have this conversation? It's really challenging.
I think you feel like it's an attack. And I know what you're saying has happened to me in conversation with friends. And I don't say what I feel because I'm, or otherwise you go to anger. And just from what I've learned a little bit, I think it's time to step back, maybe write down your feelings, and then ask to have another conversation with him. Because I think doing it at that moment never leads to something fulfilling. Usually because we forget really who we are, what we want to say, you know, because I feel attacked when that happens to me. And I feel like, oh, they're so smart, and yet I can't put my words, you know, down to make it, but I think it's just time to step back.
Hi, Elizabeth Vanderlei, confessing that I too am a freezer. I suspect I'm not alone here. I feel like Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, one of the questions we have up on the slide was, what do we do as Hope Church going forward? And I think back to the civil rights movement and what happened with the preparations that SNCC made before they they decided to take over counters. They practiced. They developed strategies. Because I think it's a natural human response to freeze. And maybe particularly so for women, but I don't know about that. But anyway, I think if we're looking for something very, very practical, I think we need to practice. I think Judy needs to say these things to me, and I have to look at Judy and formulate a response so I know how to do it.
You can think for yourself. You don't have to rely on me.
Okay, Kristen Hintz again. Just a couple of things. Where do we go from here? And I think one that I really appreciated of what the speaker said from the slide is that you go with kindness and curiosity. When there are when we're on two polarized fractions, it's really easy to cut off a conversation and go, well, we just see things differently, I'm not going to talk about it. If we don't talk about things, then it just stays buried and hidden. But the hardest part of that is, and I'll give an example. I'm door knocking and I'm talking to someone, and a person says, she's not happy with it all, and so I took that step of curiosity, and I said, tell me more, I'm really curious. And it came down to she was really concerned about her grandchildren, and she was really concerned about the grooming, and about grooming for becoming transgender, or that was a core fear for her. And I knew that I wasn't going to change her thoughts whatsoever, but to be able to listen, to understand, and to gently put a different one out without attacking her, but still sharing her understanding that she had a deep concern. And eventually I walked away from that, but it was staying in the conversation, being willing to commit to being in conversation and being curious and trying to understand the other person, and that brings it out for talking and sharing. So you start to break that fracturing. So that's the first part. The second part is somehow I got on an emailing list from Concerned Parent from Restoring Ottawa County. And I actually responded to this person by email. It was talking about the Momentum Center and the evil things that the Momentum Center in Grand Haven and Holland are doing when it comes to grooming people. And I wrote back, and the response was, I appreciate you not attacking me. I appreciate you sharing your ideas. And we disagreed with each other, but we did it so in a respectful way. And I know that he's getting a lot of comments. I know the person who writes this because I've seen him and talked with him at the county commission meetings. Young guy, probably in his mid to late 30s. And so, that would be another way, is speaking out, but speaking out of love, speaking out of presenting facts in a way that's counter to the threats that are going on, are two things that come to my mind.
Okay. Cindy Turlow. When I speak with people, it's some of my family members, and my statement to them is, I am scared that this is going to ruin my relationship with you. And I value my relationship with you deeply. How can we talk about this? And I go to the relationship piece, and I'm almost tearing as I say it, because that relationship is so important. But I also know I have to be true to my experience of God, to my understanding of how I'm responding to the world. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think about our many pastors in our community, of all of our churches. Initially in the statement of the unifying statement with the county, there were 7 churches that were willing to do this. There were many pastors willing to do it, but they knew their churches weren't behind them. We really need to speak with people in our churches and not expect our pastors to be the only ones that are standing up.
Very good.
Picking up on something Cindy said, I think relationships are really important and are not to be kind of destroyed by political differences when it's dear family. So I have extended family I spend a lot of time with that has different views, and we love each other dearly, and they're good people. And we sustain those relationships by simply not talking about some things that are how we differ, and focusing on those things that we love together. So that's the first comment. And it relates to the second one, and that is where to spend our energies. And the place not to spend your energy is trying to convince somebody at the extremes. The battle is won, history is made, elections are decided by a few people in the muddled middle. And that's where the conversation needs to take place. And I also have to say, I so admire Kristen for being out there on the street and having those conversations and modeling what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm hoping we're running out of time here. I got a couple more things to share with you. I hope this is a piece from Jamar Tisby, and one of the writers that we're reading for the big read next week. And he talks about where do we go from here, building awareness. Seems to me at Hope Church, we're just dipping our toe in this, okay? We're looking at white and minority relations a little bit, and maybe a next step is to get more aware of how those issues affect people on the ground in Holland, Michigan. And then we will come to a point in time in January of commitment. Are we on this path? Are we agreed on this path? And then from there, based on those premises, we're going to build relationships. We're going to listen to other communities within Holland about what's their vision for what works for them in Holland, and how can we build that with them? How can we be supportive? And with that in mind, some final thoughts. I want to remind you to be here next week for the big Hope Church read, okay? And encourage everyone to consider 2 opportunities shared with us by our Hope Church Unifying Hope. From Still Processing on November 2, Calvin University's Kristen Kobes-Demez, who we just heard. She's going to speak at 7 p.m. at the warehouse. There's a handout in the back that has that on it. And then the evening of November 30th, Unifying Christians of Ottawa County, in partnership with Vote Common Good West Michigan, are going to host a training session. Someone talked about training. A training session on resisting Christian nationalism with the author, pastor, and social activist Doug Padgett. He's the co-founder of the Vote Common for West Michigan. So there's 2 really good opportunities to continue our awareness process, okay? And again, within Hope Church, if you feel so moved to dig deeper in this topic, in this area, join in with either the Justice and Reconciliation Ministry, the many hands make the work go quicker, and to do that, speak with our intrepid leader, Ruth Stegman, and then, or with the Unifying Hope leaders. They have for the past X number of Sundays, they've had a poster out here and people to talk with. You can talk with either Lois or Cindy about joining that group or what you can do to help with that group. This is the link to the website, to the video that we've been using. I'm going to leave it up here. You can take a photograph of it and type it in. I got the message to share this after the thing had been made, so I couldn't do anything more with it. If that's too much for you, you can email you here and ask for the link, and I'll send the link to you. Okay? One last question?
Can you flip back to the other slide so we can take a picture of the dates of things coming up?
That's on the handout in the back, okay? So you can grab that, and then you could write that or take the picture and put it with it. Okay, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, Bob. And put your pages on the back table, the ones that you
Oh, yeah,
completed.
thank you,
Yeah,
Judy.
be sure to do that.
Please do share those, because that'll help us have a sense
See you
for
next week for the
how
big
effective
read
we
for
were.
hope.
Yay.
If you haven't read the books, there's still more books there. Some of them are what do you call it? Pictures, picture novels, graphic novels. Thank you.
Yeah, graphic novels.
You can whip through that in about half hour. So grab a book if you haven't gotten one till now. If you don't read the book, come next week anyway. There'll be a place for you.
Many thanks to this gentleman and Judy and Bob and Joyce for the treats. Okay, that's all made that done.
Quick question. If we finish reading the books and after the book read, can we put them out on the table and have an opportunity to switch with other people that might have read a different one? Because I finished my 2 and I would love to read some of the other ones that I did not pay for, but I would love to switch with someone if anyone's interested.
Good idea. We'll try to make it happen.